Welcome to Hidden Stories, where every story unlocks a new mystery waiting to be unraveled. Grab your favorite cup of coffee, settle in, and prepare to dive into a world full of twists, turns, and unexpected secrets. Stay curious and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let the adventure begin. Hercule Poirot sat in his study, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of a single lamp when the letter arrived. It was unlike any correspondence he had received before. Its edges frayed, the paper yellowed with age, and the handwriting bold yet hurried. The wax seal was broken, a rare sign that its contents were meant to be read immediately. He tore open the envelope, the words inside sending a chill through him. Beware, Poirot, of the sapphire necklace. A great tragedy awaits its possessor. Betrayal, deception, and danger will soon befall. You must act swiftly to prevent what is coming. The message was cryptic, leaving much unsaid but everything implied. Poirot knew better than to dismiss such warnings. He had seen too many dark mysteries unfold from a single, seemingly insignificant clue. His mind began to churn, picking apart the letter's terse lines, analyzing each word for hidden meaning. The sapphire necklace mentioned had to be the famous gem of Lady Eugenia Hathaway, an exceedingly wealthy yet reclusive woman known for her priceless collection of rare jewels. Lady Hathaway had a reputation not only for her exquisite taste in jewels, but for the intricate and often troubled relationships with her family. Her birthday celebrations were to be an event of grandeur, a rare opportunity for her to gather her closest kin under one roof. It seemed this evening, as if guided by fate itself, would be the perfect stage for Poirot to investigate further. Poirot stood up, adjusted his carefully tailored suit, and with a slight nod he ordered his driver to take him to the Hathaway estate. As the car rumbled through the dark streets, his thoughts remained focused on the letter. What could the warning mean? Was it a ploy to stir his curiosity, or was there truly danger lurking within the walls of Lady Hathaway's opulent mansion? The air was thick with uncertainty, yet Poirot's mind was sharp, dissecting every detail of the mystery that lay before him. When he arrived at the estate, the scene that greeted him was almost surreal. The mansion stood imposingly in the distance, shrouded by tall hedges and bathed in the glow of strategically placed lanterns. The evening air carried the faintest scent of roses and rain, and the atmosphere felt heavy, as though the night itself was holding its breath. Poirot could sense it immediately. Tension, subtle but undeniable, hung in the air. The grand hall was aglow with warmth and music, yet Poirot's keen senses detected an undercurrent of unease. The sapphire necklace, which had been the subject of so many whispered conversations, was displayed in a locked glass case at the center of the room, its blue hue seeming to mock the gravity of the evening. Lady Hathaway, serene and composed, stood nearby, greeting her guests. Despite her calm demeanor, there was something in her eyes, something not entirely at ease. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," she greeted him with a smile that seemed both polite and distant. "I'm glad you could join us this evening. It is rare that I host such a gathering, and I must admit my family's presence here tonight brings a certain tension to the air. Perhaps it is the weight of my legacy," she added, her voice growing softer. Poirot's sharp gaze remained on the necklace, the glittering gem seemingly mocking him with its unassuming beauty. He smiled, nodding politely as he made his way deeper into the room, his attention now divided among the guests. There was the lady's niece, a striking woman with a coldness to her smile, and her nephew, who appeared uncomfortably detached from the proceedings. Both seemed to hold a sense of entitlement, as though their future wealth depended on the inheritance of Lady Hathaway's fortune. A mysterious foreign guest stood quietly in the corner, his demeanor charming but distant. His presence was unusual, and Poirot found himself intrigued by the man's enigmatic air. And then there was the long-time family servant, An older man who seemed to be hiding something, his nervous glances betraying the calm facade he tried so hard to maintain. As the evening unfolded, Poirot observed the subtle exchanges between the guests, each one more calculated than the last. Everyone seemed to be playing a role, hiding their true intentions behind carefully constructed facades. Yet Poirot sensed something deeper, a web of deceit woven into every conversation, every glance, every movement. No one seemed entirely innocent, least of all Lady Hathaway, whose carefully guarded demeanor only fueled his suspicions. Then, just as Poirot was beginning to formulate his thoughts, an alarming cry broke the tension in the room. "The necklace! It's gone!" The voice belonged to Lady Hathaway. Her face pale and stricken with shock, she claimed to have seen an unfamiliar figure near the glass case, a shadow flitting past just moments before the gem vanished into thin air. Panic spread like wildfire as the guests whispered among themselves, accusations rising as quickly as the mounting suspicion. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the room. The game had begun. The mansion loomed in the distance, its silhouette casting long shadows against the encroaching night. Lady Eugenia Hathaway's estate was as grand as it was imposing, a sprawling structure of grey stone and towering windows that seemed to gaze unblinkingly out at the world. The interior was no less awe-inspiring, a labyrinth of opulent rooms, high ceilings and long, echoing corridors. The very walls of the house seemed to hold secrets, whispers of long-buried family drama, whispered promises and betrayal. It was a place where no corner was truly safe, and every door seemed to lead to another enigma. As Hercule Poirot entered the dimly lit hallway, his sharp eyes took in every detail. The marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, and heavy velvet curtains framed the windows, filtering the light from the outside world. Portraits of Hathaway ancestors adorned the walls, their cold, calculating gazes never leaving the guests. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of history, and with something darker, a palpable tension that hung in the air like smoke. Poirot had already spoken briefly with Lady Hathaway, who was visibly shaken by the disappearance of her prized sapphire necklace. Her distress was genuine, but there was something about her calm facade that made him wonder. Her eyes seemed to betray an underlying anxiety, as if she feared something much more than the loss of a jewel. Was it the necklace itself, or something deeper? Something the guests in her home might have known. He had to delve deeper. He began with Lady Hathaway herself, who had retreated to a quiet corner of the drawing room, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a glass of wine. Poirot approached her with his usual grace, offering a gentle, reassuring smile. "Madame," he began, his voice soft but penetrating, "your distress is clear, but I must ask, when you saw the figure near the case, what did you truly see? Could it have been a trick of the light, or perhaps someone's shadow?" Lady Hathaway took a long, measured sip of wine, her eyes lowering as though considering the question carefully. When she spoke, her voice was smooth, though tinged with an unease that Poirot could not ignore. "I saw him," she replied, her gaze flickering toward the locked case where the necklace had been. "A man? A figure? Dressed in dark clothes? He moved so swiftly that I could scarcely believe it, but I know what I saw. I've always had a keen sense for such things." Poirot nodded, noting the way her fingers clenched tighter around her glass. Her face remained composed, but the small details, the tightness of her smile, the nervous darting of her eyes, suggested something she wasn't saying, something she was hiding. "Of course, madame," Poirot said softly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I do not doubt your word, but allow me to ask, why do you think someone would risk so much to steal your necklace? Could it be tied to something more personal?" Lady Hathaway hesitated, then looked up, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. "This necklace has been in my family for generations," she said, her voice steady. "It is not just a jewel, Monsieur Poirot. It is a symbol of our legacy, and, perhaps, of the very thing that has kept us together all these years, or torn us apart." Her eyes drifted, almost unconsciously, to the doorway where her niece, Irene Hathaway, stood observing them. Poirot's mind quickly turned toward the young woman. Irene Hathaway was a striking figure, tall, elegant, but with an air of bitterness that seemed to seep from every pore. The faintest trace of resentment flickered in her eyes as she watched her aunt, and Poirot could almost hear the unspoken words between them. Approaching Irene, Poirot gave her a polite smile. "Mademoiselle Hathaway, you are quite a striking figure among these distinguished guests. It must be quite difficult being in the shadow of such a legacy, no?" Irene's lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer, her eyes narrowing. "My aunt has always been the center of attention, Monsieur Poirot, but I have learned to stay in the background. People in her world tend to forget about those who have nothing to offer." Poirot could not ignore the weight in her words. "But surely you are not without your own gifts, mademoiselle. You must have much to offer." She laughed, the sound bitter and hollow. She said, "Perhaps, but not what she values, not like that necklace, or the inheritance it represents. You see, I have my own ambitions, Monsieur Poirot, but they do not include waiting around for handouts." Her gaze lingered for a moment, then shifted to the door. Poirot followed her line of sight to where Edward Hathaway, the nephew, stood by the window, gazing out into the night. Poirot turned his attention to the young man. Edward Hathaway was dressed in a sharp suit, but the strain on his face was undeniable. He was the picture of entitlement, yet there was a restlessness in him, a sense of something undone. When Poirot approached, Edward looked up with a look of barely concealed irritation. "Edward Hathaway, I presume?" Poirot said, offering a polite nod. Edward returned the gesture with an icy smile. "Monsieur Poirot, I'm sure you've heard of me. It's quite a spectacle, isn't it? My dear aunt's necklace is gone, and I'm certain everyone is eager to point fingers." His voice dripped with sarcasm, but Poirot could sense something beneath the bravado, something dark, something unresolved. "I've heard much about you, monsieur," Poirot said carefully, his gaze narrowing. "Your family's wealth, your troubles. I understand that you've been struggling financially. Would it not be tempting, then, to lay claim to something as precious as that necklace?" Edward's face tightened, his jaw clenching. "Tempting, yes, but I'm no fool. I'm not the one to steal from my own blood. Besides, I've got nothing to gain from a trinket like that." His words were blunt, but Poirot could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Before Poirot could press further, a voice broke in, this time a deep, almost melodic tone. "I am sure we are all aware of the delicate situation, yes? But let us not jump to conclusions." Turning, Poirot's gaze landed on Fedor Kovac, the mysterious foreign guest who had remained largely in the background until now. Kovac was tall, well-built, and impeccably dressed. His accent was faint but noticeable, and his eyes gleamed with an unsettling curiosity. There was something almost predatory in the way he observed the room, a keen sense of awareness that made Poirot uneasy. "You know much about this family, monsieur?" Poirot inquired, eyeing him carefully. Kovac's lips curled into a small smile, but there was something calculating about it. "I know enough, Monsieur Poirot. I've been in the business of understanding people for a long time, and I have a particular interest in rare things, such as Lady Hathaway's collection." Poirot's suspicion deepened. Kovac seemed too well versed in the family's affairs, and his interest in the necklace went beyond that of an ordinary guest. As Poirot continued to gather his thoughts, the elderly servant, Mrs. Mulliner, approached. She had been with the family for decades, her loyalty to Lady Hathaway unquestionable, but her demeanor now was far from comforting. The old woman's eyes darted nervously from one guest to the next, and her hands trembled ever so slightly as she clutched a tray. "Is something wrong, Mrs. Mulliner?" Poirot asked gently, noting her unease. The woman looked up at him, her face a mixture of fear and guilt. "I've been with this family a long time, monsieur. Longer than anyone else in this house. But there's something amiss. There are things in this house, things that should be left alone." Her voice trembled as she spoke. Poirot's curiosity deepened, but before he could inquire further, a shadow passed behind her. One of the other guests, perhaps, leaving Mrs. Mulliner to fall silent once again. The puzzle pieces were slowly beginning to fall into place, but Poirot knew there was much more to uncover. Every guest had a story, and every story held a clue. Yet, with each passing moment, the truth seemed more elusive. Who had taken the sapphire necklace, and why? More importantly, what dark secrets did Lady Eugenia Hathaway's estate hold within its walls? As Poirot moved deeper into the heart of the mansion, he felt the weight of the mystery pressing in on him. He was not just solving a theft, he was uncovering a long-forgotten truth. The early morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Lady Hathaway's private study, casting long shadows across the room. The scene of the crime was meticulously pristine, almost unnervingly so. The polished wooden furniture gleamed under the soft glow, the fine carpets unruffled by any disturbance. On the wall, portraits of the Hathaway ancestors gazed down with cold, painted eyes, as if silently watching the investigation unfold. At the center of the room stood the locked glass case, a simple yet elegant structure that had once held the priceless necklace. Hercule Poirot stood in front of the case, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the room with meticulous precision. The case itself appeared untouched, with no signs of forced entry. The lock was intact, the glass unbroken. Yet, there was something undeniably unsettling about the scene. The room was in perfect order, and yet the air itself seemed to carry the scent of something foreign. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but Poirot's senses never missed a detail. A mixture of perfumes, possibly, or perhaps a trace of something more sinister. Poirot stepped closer to the case, his fingers lightly brushing the surface of the glass, as though he could feel the presence of the missing necklace just beyond it. He examined the intricate carvings of the case, delicate patterns that seemed to have been crafted with great care. But for all its beauty, the case was a mere barrier between the jewel and the world. The scent lingered, an intangible clue that Poirot could not yet place. The room had an atmosphere of quiet tension, one that seemed to mirror the intricate web of relationships that had brought Poirot to this isolated mansion. The Hathaway family was riddled with secrets and hidden animosities. Lady Eugenia Hathaway, with her air of aloofness, had invited Poirot here to investigate the disappearance of the necklace, a piece of her considerable wealth. But what lay beneath the surface of this genteel family was a far more complex and volatile situation, and Poirot was determined to uncover it. Turning away from the case, Poirot motioned to the room's only other occupant, Lady Hathaway herself. The matriarch of the Hathaway family stood near the window, her hands clasped in front of her, as though she was holding something fragile. She was a woman of impeccable grace, her demeanor dignified despite the troubling circumstances. Yet beneath her composed exterior, Poirot could see the faintest signs of strain. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, her lips pressed together in an almost imperceptible grimace. There was something in her eyes, anxiety, perhaps, or fear, that Poirot could not ignore. Poirot began, his voice calm and soothing. "We must discuss the details of the evening in question. You mentioned that the combination to the glass case was known only to you. Are you certain that no one else had access to the code?" Lady Hathaway's eyes flickered for a brief moment before she answered, her voice steady but laced with tension. "I am certain, Monsieur Poirot. Only I know the combination. No one else had the chance to steal the necklace." She paused, and Poirot noticed her gaze briefly flicker toward the study door, as if half expecting someone to walk in. "My family, you see, well, they are deeply in debt. There are grudges, old and new, and the prospect of inheritance has stirred up unpleasant emotions. But none of them would stoop to stealing, not in such a blatant way." Poirot listened intently, noting the subtle hints of nervousness in her voice. The mention of debts and grudges was not lost on him. It seemed that the Hathaway family's wealth had become a burden, and in such a situation the lure of a valuable necklace could easily become a catalyst for dark actions. "And yet, the necklace is gone, Lady Hathaway," Poirot said softly, allowing the words to settle in the air. "It is a mystery that must be solved, and I will require your full cooperation." Lady Hathaway nodded, her expression unreadable. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. I want to see the culprit brought to justice, but I assure you no one in this house would steal from me. Not like this." Poirot's next stop was Irene Hathaway, the niece. She had been in the study earlier, but Poirot had noted her reluctance to speak about the details of that evening. Now, as he entered the parlour where Irene was seated, he immediately sensed her discomfort. She sat stiffly in a chair, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her eyes avoided his gaze, darting nervously around the room. Irene's nervousness was palpable, and Poirot could not help but wonder if her unease was due to guilt. "Irene," Poirot began gently, "I understand that you were in the study earlier this evening. Can you tell me what happened when you were there?" Irene shifted in her seat, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was there, yes. But I didn't take the necklace, Monsieur Poirot. I don't even care about it. It's just a piece of jewellery. My aunt, she's obsessed with her wealth. That's all anyone ever talks about in this house. Money and inheritance." She paused, her hands trembling slightly. "I didn't steal it." Poirot studied Irene closely. Her reaction was odd, too defensive, too eager to distance herself from the crime. Her words didn't match the intensity of her emotions. Poirot's instincts told him that there was more to her indifference than met the eye. "I understand," Poirot said, his tone reassuring but firm. "But you must understand that everyone in this house is under suspicion, and the fact that you are so eager to distance yourself from the necklace raises questions." Irene's face flushed with frustration, but she did not respond further. Poirot made a mental note of her behavior. A possible motive was beginning to take shape, one rooted not in a desire for the necklace itself, but perhaps in the inheritance it represented. Edward Hathaway, the nephew, was next. He appeared in the hallway, his expression drawn, his eyes weary with exhaustion. His casual demeanor masked a palpable tension beneath the surface. Edward was a man of many grievances with his family, with his finances, with his life in general, but it was his proximity to the study that made him a prime suspect. "I was in the study earlier," Edward admitted, though his voice lacked the conviction one would expect from an innocent man. "I had a brief argument with my aunt. About money, as usual. I was going to leave, but, well, it's odd, isn't it? The necklace is gone, and I can't help but wonder if anyone else might have had an interest in it, like Fedor Kovac, for instance." He was near the study before the necklace disappeared. Poirot's sharp gaze narrowed at the mention of Kovac's. Edward's attempt to redirect suspicion onto the foreign guest seemed calculated. "You saw Fedor near the study. At what time?" Edward hesitated before answering. "It was just before the necklace went missing. He was walking around the house, looking at things. He's always asking about the family's finances, you know, and I just don't trust him." Poirot took note of the implications. Edward's bitterness toward his family, coupled with his financial troubles, made him an interesting suspect. But Poirot's attention was now firmly fixed on Fedor Kovac, who had been mentioned twice now. There was more to him than met the eye. Fedor Kovac was the next to be questioned. He was a striking figure, tall, dark-haired, with an air of mystery that made him all the more intriguing. His charm was undeniable, but his responses were far from forthcoming. Poirot found him evasive, deflecting questions with practiced ease. "I have been acquainted with Lady Hathaway for many years," Kovac said smoothly. "But as for the necklace, I know nothing about it. I was simply a guest in her home, enjoying the hospitality." Poirot studied him closely, his sharp mind piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. Kovac's aloofness only heightened Poirot's suspicion. His familiarity with the family's finances raised more questions than answers. Finally, Mrs. Mulliner, the elderly servant, spoke up. She had been silent for much of the investigation, her hands folded in her lap as she observed the others. But now she seemed eager to offer a piece of information. "I overheard something," she said softly, her voice wavering. "In desperate," Poirot protested. "I heard Irene and Edward arguing earlier in the evening. They were talking about secrets. Family secrets, I think. But I don't know what they were saying. I couldn't hear everything." Poirot's ears pricked at the mention of family secrets. He leaned in, his curiosity piqued. "And what did you hear exactly, Mrs. Mulliner?" Mrs. Mulliner hesitated before answering. "I don't know, Monsieur Poirot. I was just passing by and I overheard their voices raised in anger, but I couldn't make out the words. I'm sorry." Poirot thanked her and made a mental note of the exchange. It was vague, but it was a clue. Another thread in the tangled web of family secrets and old grudges. The investigation was far from over, but Poirot knew one thing for certain. The truth was hidden in the details, and he would uncover it piece by piece. The clues were starting to fall into place, but Poirot had only scratched the surface. There were discrepancies in the stories, motives hidden beneath the surface, and an ever-growing web of deceit. Each character was a potential suspect, each with their own secrets and hidden desires. And in this house of secrets, nothing was quite as it seemed. With each passing moment, the investigation grew more complex, more intricate, but Poirot was determined. He would unravel the mystery of the missing necklace, and when he did, he would expose the truth that lay hidden in the shadows of Lady Hathaway's grand mansion. The investigation continued, winding deeper into the dark recesses of the Hathaway family's past, with each new revelation shedding light on the tangled web of secrets, jealousy, and old wounds that had festered for years. Hercule Poirot, ever meticulous and thorough, sought out the truth beneath the surface, where the murky waters of inheritance, betrayal, and hidden relationships threatened to drown even the most careful of eyes. Poirot sat in his study, going over the details of his interviews, the facts from the crime scene, and the peculiarities of each suspect's testimony. Lady Hathaway's sapphire necklace was no mere piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of power, status, and the wealth that had divided the Hathaway family for generations. The circumstances of the theft seemed increasingly complex. If Poirot had learned anything about human nature, it was that no one was entirely innocent in such affairs, especially when the stakes were high. The first thread Poirot pulled on was the history of the sapphire necklace itself. He had already discovered its immense value, but it was more than just the cost that made it so important. The necklace had been passed down through generations, a treasure coveted by every heir, every relative who dreamed of securing their place in the Hathaway fortune. It had been the source of bitter rivalries, heated arguments, and, most tellingly, the cause of Lady Hathaway's isolation. From the moment Poirot began questioning her, he noticed that Lady Hathaway seemed almost too composed, too calm. It was a facade, he suspected, a mask to hide the storm of emotions that raged just beneath the surface. When Poirot asked her about the necklace, Lady Hathaway's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "The necklace was my mother's," she explained, her voice soft but firm. "It has always been a part of our family, a symbol of our lineage, but it is also a reminder of the price of such wealth." She hesitated, then added, "My family has fought over it for generations. It has caused nothing but grief." Poirot leaned forward, sensing an opening. "And you, Lady Hathaway, do you believe the necklace holds a special power? To stir up emotions, perhaps?" A shadow passed over her face, but she recovered quickly. "Yes, I suppose it does. It has brought nothing but greed and hatred into our lives. I have often wondered if it was a curse." As Poirot probed further, he uncovered a surprising and tragic chapter from Lady Hathaway's past. In her youth, she had been in love with a man named Victor Hawke, a passionate, forbidden affair that had sent shockwaves through her family. The relationship had ended in tragedy when Hawke was killed in a mysterious accident. Lady Hathaway's sorrow had been profound, but she carried with her a deep sense of guilt. Poirot saw in her eyes something more than just mourning. It was as though she blamed herself for his death. But the true impact of the affair was much deeper than that. It seemed that Hawke's death had set off a chain of events that led to a secret inheritance, one that rivaled Lady Hathaway's wealth. The existence of this hidden fortune had fueled bitter resentment among her relatives, particularly Irene Hathaway. Irene's bitterness was palpable when Poirot questioned her. She had always been a striking figure, her aloof demeanor a careful shield against the world's judgments. But in Poirot's presence, her walls began to crumble. "I have nothing to say about the necklace," Irene replied, her voice almost too dismissive, her eyes avoiding Poirot's gaze. "I don't care about it." Poirot arched an eyebrow. "Ah, but surely you must care about something, Mademoiselle Hathaway. Why, then, do you seem so indifferent to your aunt's loss?" Irene's lips twitched in an almost imperceptible sneer. "Lady Hathaway has never cared for me," she muttered. "She's always been too wrapped up in her own world, her own guilt. I never stood a chance with her." Poirot noted the bitterness in Irene's tone. But there was more. He had heard rumors of Irene's engagement to a wealthy suitor, someone who had mysteriously disappeared shortly after the engagement was called off. The suitor's family had allegedly threatened revenge, and Irene's sour attitude toward her aunt was, perhaps, a product of that failed union. The necklace, after all, was a symbol of wealth, and Irene had never been shy about her desire for a larger share of the family's fortune. Next, Poirot turned his attention to Edward Hathaway, Lady Hathaway's nephew. Edward was a man of many faces, but Poirot had seen through them all. His appearance, well-groomed, confident, even charming, belied the financial troubles that haunted him. When Poirot questioned him, Edward seemed eager to provide information, almost too eager. "I was in the study earlier," he confessed, "but I left after a disagreement with my aunt. We were discussing money." Again. "She never seemed to understand how hard things have been for me." Poirot listened intently. Edward had made no secret of his dire financial situation. He had borrowed large sums from questionable sources, and his debts had been piling up. The sapphire necklace could solve all of his problems, and Poirot suspected that Edward's financial troubles were a key motivation behind the theft. But was it enough to make him steal from his aunt? Poirot was not so sure. As Poirot's investigation continued, the figure of Fedor Kovac became more enigmatic. Kovac, a long-time family acquaintance, was charming and affable, but Poirot sensed a deeper, more guarded nature beneath the surface. When asked about his relationship with Lady Hathaway, Kovac's response was both casual and evasive. "I've known Lady Hathaway for years," he said, a sly smile on his lips. "We've always been good friends." Poirot raised an eyebrow at the word friend. There was something about the way Kovac said it that made Poirot suspicious. Could the relationship between Kovac and Lady Hathaway be more than just friendship? Poirot was not one to jump to conclusions, but he knew that everything had to be questioned in a case like this. The final piece of the puzzle, however, came from an unlikely source. Mrs. Mulliner, the Hathaway family's servant. Mrs. Mulliner had always seemed like a quiet, inconspicuous figure, but Poirot had learned not to dismiss anyone in his investigations. When questioned, Mrs. Mulliner was initially hesitant, but Poirot's probing eventually drew out an intriguing piece of information. "I overheard something," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "Irene and Edward, they were arguing in the hallway earlier. It was about family secrets. Things I couldn't quite understand, but I heard enough to know it was serious." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Family secrets? What kind of secrets, Monsieur Mulliner?" The servant hesitated. "I don't know. They were talking about money, about inheritance. Something about a man who had died years ago, but I didn't understand it fully." Poirot knew instantly that Mrs. Mulliner was holding something back. What was it that she hadn't mentioned? The reference to the mysterious death from years ago. Was it related to Lady Hathaway's ill-fated love affair, or was it something entirely different? Poirot's mind raced with possibilities. As the investigation unraveled further, it became clear that each family member had a motive to take the necklace. Irene's bitterness, Edward's financial troubles, Kovac's enigmatic connection to Lady Hathaway, and Mrs. Mulliner's cryptic information all pointed to a deeper, more intricate conspiracy. But the truth, Poirot knew, would not be easily uncovered. In every lie there was a kernel of truth, and in every secret there was a motive just waiting to be exposed. Poirot sat back in his chair, contemplating the tangled web of lies that had been woven around the Hathaway family. The necklace had vanished, but the real theft, the betrayal, the lies, the secrets, were still hidden in the shadows, and it was up to Poirot to bring it all into the light. With his mind sharp as ever, Poirot knew that he was close, but the deeper he delved, the more dangerous the truth became. Every family secret uncovered led to new questions, and every new question brought him closer to the heart of the mystery. The investigation was far from over, and the game was afoot. Hercule Poirot sat at the desk in his room, surrounded by a series of notes, each one leading to new questions, false trails, and mounting pressure. The sapphire necklace had not only disappeared, but seemed to have taken with it the carefully crafted facades of the Hathaway family. Poirot's investigation, once filled with promising clues, had now become a maze of misdirection. The closer he got to the truth, the more elusive it seemed. Each suspect, each person in the Hathaway household was hiding something, but what? And who had the most to lose? Poirot's sharp mind refused to accept defeat. He was determined to get to the heart of the mystery, no matter how tangled the threads of deception had become. The first misdirection came in the form of Fedor Kovac, whose connection to Lady Hathaway had initially seemed both suspicious and promising. When Poirot had first interviewed Kovac, he had noted the man's polished charm and guarded demeanor. In a case like this, charm often masked hidden intentions. Poirot had reasoned that Kovac might have stolen the necklace, not out of greed, but to gain leverage over Lady Hathaway. The necklace could be worth a small fortune, and it was clear that Lady Hathaway's wealth and the power that came with it was something Kovac might covet. Poirot had followed the lead, questioning Kovac more closely. He watched the man's reactions carefully, hoping to spot any tell that would confirm his suspicions. But to Poirot's surprise, Kovac seemed genuinely shocked when told of the theft. His face turned pale, and he stammered slightly. This cannot be true," Kovac had said, running a hand through his hair. "I never... Why would I steal it? I have no need for the money. Lady Hathaway and I, we..." He stopped himself, realizing his words could implicate him further. Poirot studied him carefully. Kovac's genuine disbelief didn't match the cold, calculating thief Poirot had expected. The man was not the one behind the theft, or so it seemed. Kovac had no financial trouble of his own that would drive him to take such a desperate action. His wealth was secured elsewhere, and his ties to Lady Hathaway, while close, were not enough to make him a likely candidate for such a crime. Poirot's initial theory had fallen apart in an instant. Kovac was no thief. The investigation then led Poirot to another possible suspect, Edward Hathaway. The young man's financial difficulties were well known within the family, and his mounting debts were substantial enough that the loss of the necklace could solve all his problems. It seemed logical to Poirot that Edward might have staged the theft in an attempt to cover up his financial woes. If he could steal the necklace, he could either sell it or leverage it for a better position within the family. Poirot had his doubts, but the timing of the theft, combined with Edward's prior financial issues, made him a natural suspect. Poirot decided to focus his attention on Edward, following him discreetly around the estate. It wasn't long before Poirot uncovered something that seemed to confirm his suspicions. Edward had been seen entering the study earlier on the night of the theft, and the timing was suspicious. Was it possible that he had taken the necklace, hidden it somewhere, and then staged its disappearance? Poirot, ever the methodical investigator, conducted a thorough check of Edward's alibi. To his surprise, the evidence began to clear Edward of suspicion. According to multiple sources, Edward had been seen in the company of several guests during the time the necklace had been stolen. His whereabouts had been accounted for, and there was no gap in his alibi. He could not have stolen the necklace, and Poirot knew it. The investigation now had a new wrinkle, one that added to the complexity of the case. If neither Kovac nor Edward had taken the necklace, then who had? The rising tension in the Hathaway mansion was palpable, and Poirot knew time was running out. As each lead turned cold, Poirot felt the pressure mounting. The family, once cordial and welcoming, was becoming more and more fractured with each passing day. The atmosphere within the house had grown icy, and the guests seemed increasingly paranoid. Irene Hathaway, who had once been aloof and indifferent, now acted with a nervous energy that was impossible to ignore. She would dart glances around the room, as if she feared someone was watching her. Edward, despite his cleared name, seemed agitated and restless, frequently excusing himself from conversations and retreating to the privacy of his study. The entire family, including the servants, had begun to mistrust one another, and whispers filled the halls of the estate. Lady Hathaway, too, had become more anxious. She spent hours in her private rooms, away from the guests, and when Poirot had visited her for another round of questioning, she seemed increasingly frail. There were moments when she stared at Poirot, almost as though she expected him to reveal the truth about something far darker than the theft. Her guilt was written all over her face, but Poirot couldn't determine whether it was guilt over the necklace or something deeper, something more personal. And then there was Mrs. Mulliner, the servant. The quiet, unassuming woman had remained largely in the background throughout the investigation, but Poirot knew better than to dismiss anyone. Mrs. Mulliner's role had become increasingly significant in Poirot's mind. She had been close to Lady Hathaway's late husband, and the fact that she had overheard the heated conversation between Irene and Edward had given Poirot pause. It was possible that she knew more than she had let on, but she remained tight-lipped. Poirot's mind raced. The web of lies had become almost suffocating, and Poirot felt as though he was running out of time. He had to act quickly before the rising paranoia turned violent. The stakes were higher now, and with every passing moment, someone in that mansion seemed to be edging closer to the breaking point. Poirot's attention was drawn to the smallest details, tiny inconsistencies that others might have overlooked. The way a chair had been slightly moved, the faintest trace of dust on the floor, the position of the curtains in the study where the necklace had disappeared. Each of these clues was important, but still, they didn't tell the full story. Who, in the end, could have taken the necklace without raising suspicion? Who had the most to gain from its disappearance? It was a chilling realization that brought Poirot to a startling conclusion. The true thief wasn't someone who had acted out of desperation. No, the thief was someone who had bided their time, who had meticulously planned their move, and who had carefully concealed their involvement. In such a tightly knit family, the thief had to be someone with a deep understanding of the inner workings of the household, someone who had anticipated Poirot's every move. Poirot had to dig deeper into the psychology of the suspects. There was no simple solution here, no single moment that would reveal the thief. The truth was hidden in the layers of mistrust, jealousy, and guilt that had been festering for years. The investigation had reached a critical juncture. Poirot could sense the walls closing in on the Hathaway family, and with every passing second the stakes grew higher. He knew that soon the final confrontation would come. Someone would crack under the pressure, and Poirot would be ready to expose the truth, no matter how dark or dangerous it might be. As the clock ticked down, Poirot tightened his grip on the investigation, knowing that the true thief was someone who had played the long game. They had all been caught in a web of false leads, but only Poirot, with his keen sense of deduction, could see through the lies. The game was afoot, and Poirot would bring it to its thrilling conclusion. The drawing room of Hathaway Manor was unnervingly quiet as Hercule Poirot stood before the gathered family members. The grand chandelier overhead seemed to cast long, oppressive shadows on the faces of those in the room. Each of them, once proud and dignified, now appeared frail under the weight of Poirot's gaze. The game had reached its climax, and he knew the time had come to reveal the truth. Lady Hathaway, now more fragile than ever, sat in her favourite chair, her hands folded in her lap. Edward and Irene stood near the fireplace, their eyes darting nervously between Poirot and each other. Kovath, as stoic as ever, leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, his sharp eyes betraying none of his emotions. Mrs. Mulliner, standing slightly apart from the others, looked as composed as ever, though her discomfort was palpable. Poirot could feel the tension in the air, each breath heavy with anticipation. "I have gathered you here, mes amis," Poirot began, his voice calm but commanding, "for the moment of truth. The thief among you has been revealed through the very elements of the crime, through careful observation and deduction. The sapphire necklace stolen under the guise of a mere theft was no ordinary crime. It was, in fact, a carefully orchestrated ruse." A collective breath was held. The family shifted in their seats, their eyes flickering uneasily. Poirot's eyes scanned each of them before settling on Irene Hathaway. "Mademoiselle Hathaway," he said, his voice carrying a quiet certainty, "it is you who has orchestrated this elaborate theft." The words hit Irene like a physical blow. She froze, her face draining of colour. For a moment she seemed unable to breathe, her gaze locking onto Poirot's with a mixture of disbelief and growing panic. The others in the room exchanged confused glances, unsure of how to react. Poirot continued, his voice growing firmer. "You had a plan, Mademoiselle Hathaway, a plan to frame Fedor Kovac for the theft of the necklace, all in an effort to secure your future. Your bitterness towards your aunt's wealth and the inheritance you felt was rightfully yours led you to this desperate measure. You knew that with the necklace gone, the family would be thrown into disarray, and the chances of securing Lady Hathaway's fortune for yourself would rise." Irene's hands trembled as she clenched them together, but she did not speak. Poirot's words cut through the air like a blade, each one a reminder of her own carefully hidden resentments and ambitions. "The theft," Poirot went on, "was no accident. You used your intimate knowledge of Lady Hathaway's daily routine to plan the perfect crime. When your aunt took her afternoon rest, you knew she would be out of sight for a time, allowing you to strike. You had watched the servants, you had seen how the family members interacted with the necklace, and you knew the right moment to take it." Irene's eyes flickered to Kovac. and Poirot could see the slightest hint of fear in her expression. "But the most clever part of your plan, Mademoiselle Hathaway," Poirot said, pausing for dramatic effect, "was your attempt to frame Kovac. You had already planted the seeds of suspicion, positioning him as the perfect scapegoat. You knew that Lady Hathaway's attachment to Kovac might make him an easy target. So you staged the scene. You planted the necklace in his quarters, hoping that when it was found he would be blamed." Irene's lips trembled. I didn't," she whispered, but the words faltered. Poirot raised a hand, signaling her silence. "Do not try to deny it now, Mademoiselle Hathaway. It is all too clear. The false clues, the misplaced evidence, they all pointed to Kovac. But I, Hercule Poirot, was not so easily deceived. The evidence did not match, and as I followed the trail, it led me straight to you." A murmur ran through the room. Edward, who had been standing by the fireplace, suddenly stepped forward, his face pale. "Irene, no, this is madness. How could you?" Irene's gaze flickered briefly to Edward, but her resolve hardened. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I needed that necklace. It was my only chance to secure my future. I had nothing left. Lady Hathaway was never going to leave me anything. Kovac, he was her confidant, and I was just the poor relative. I couldn't stand by and watch her pass everything onto him." The weight of her confession hung in the room like a thick fog. The family, who had once seemed united in their wealth and privilege, now stood divided by their own betrayals. Lady Hathaway looked as though she had aged years in the span of a few moments. She stared at Irene, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and disbelief. Poirot stepped forward, his expression never faltering. "You see, Mademoiselle Hathaway, your plan was based on one simple miscalculation. You underestimated the power of truth. You believed you could hide behind lies, behind deception. But truth, no matter how carefully concealed, always finds its way to the surface." Irene's eyes narrowed in defiance, but the fight seemed to leave her. She was caught, and she knew it. The game had come to an end. The necklace, her precious key to the Hathaway fortune, was no longer within her reach. Poirot's gaze softened slightly as he spoke again, his tone more contemplative. "But what is truly tragic, Mademoiselle Hathaway, is not the theft itself. It is the destruction of your own integrity. You have lost something far more valuable than any inheritance, the respect and trust of your family." With a heavy sigh, Poirot turned to Mrs. Mulliner, who had been silently watching the confrontation. "And you, madame," he said, his voice tinged with finality, "you were the key to understanding the final piece of the puzzle. It was your actions that gave Irene the opportunity to carry out her plan, though you yourself were not directly involved." Mrs. Mulliner's eyes lowered in shame, but Poirot's focus now shifted back to Irene. The final confrontation had taken place, and the truth was out. The stolen necklace, that symbol of both power and greed, was returned to its rightful place in Lady Hathaway's possession. The damage, however, had been done. The family, once united in their wealth and privilege, now had to come to terms with the consequences of their actions. Poirot looked around the room one last time, his sharp eyes taking in the faces of the Hathaway family, now broken and exposed. The theft had been the catalyst for the unraveling of their carefully constructed lives. In the end, it wasn't the loss of the sapphire necklace that mattered, it was the damage done to the trust that had once bound them together. With the case closed, Poirot turned on his heel, his work done. He gave one final glance at Lady Hathaway, whose eyes were filled with sorrow and regret. "I leave you with this, madame," Poirot said softly. "The truth may be painful, but it is the only thing that will set you free." And with that, Hercule Poirot departed, his satisfaction quiet but complete, knowing that justice had been served. Thank you for tuning in to Hidden Stories. If you enjoyed the intrigue, suspense, and the thrill of the chase, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Stay updated on more captivating detective adventures that will keep you at the edge of your seat. Your support makes it possible to continue bringing these stories to life. Keep the mysteries alive. Until next time.